I want to thank you to be here and share this space with me. I'm really honored to be here with you. It's such an amazing community of artists, developers, and everyone involved with this amazing software. Who am I? Who's talking? Well, I'm Leonardo. I'm 25 years old. I'm from Colombia, really far away from here. And I'm a 3D artist. This year I'll accomplish 5 years working just for video games. Those are some of the companies that I had the pleasure to work with as a service provider. And today in this talk, I want to talk about how I implement Blender for the game art pipeline. I want to show a few case scenarios where I use it. Mostly, I use Blender for prop and environments, but I also want to show you some experiments that I've been doing recently, like exploring more about the capabilities that Blender has for character concepting. And also, I want to show you some experiments where I stress out the tool to see how many polygons Blender can handle. The presentation is going to be divided into sections. In the first one, I'm going to show those experiments that I'm talking about. And in the second one, I'm going to show you some use case scenarios where I implement Blender for my own profession, which is mostly prop art and environment art. This is the result of a lot of research that I've been doing in the recent months, and also various talks that I had the pleasure to have with some of my colleagues during my professional career. So maybe for some of you, what I'm going to say is really irrelevant, or maybe you already know it, but I really hope that this talk show you another way to explore this amazing tool. So those are some of the examples that I'm going to show you in terms of character concepting that I've been doing, trying to manage all of the process creation just using Blender. Of course, in some parts, I have to use some other packages. Like for the texturing part, I had to use the Adobe Suite. But in those experiments, I try to use a lot Blender. I try to carry out the whole process creation on it. Let's talk about one of the key features that I mentioned in the title of this conference. Of course, I only mentioned 3, but I want to make it clear that my intention is to show that Blender itself, it's a holistic tool, and it's essential for game art pipeline in a whole. So it's because their different modes are so well connected that it feels organic to make the transition between, for example, the high poly and the low poly creation. So that's my main idea, drive you through the process creation and show you some interesting steps that I consider that are essential for this. Recently, for the sculpting mode, we had special features that allows you to unlock a full potential to start working with heavy models in terms of poly budget. What you're seeing here is one of the examples that I want to illustrate you. Like you are seeing here, most of the details were carried out in the high poly using some of the tools that Blender allows you. For example, the multi-res modifier, which if you plug it in your base model, you can have a lot of different subdivision and start increasing the amount of details without losing too much performance. So this is one of the examples that I'm going to talk about. So Blender is a voxelize the meshes to create the sculpting. It's not like ZBrush, which uses another type of technology. This is why Blender is it's not so powerful for handling high poly models. But despite that, the recent module in the latest version of Blender was really it's really powerful because it enhanced the experience to sculpt this kind of voxelized meshes. So you can start like sculpting with a 10 million polygons mesh, and you can increase that if you make like some sort of retopology and try to bake those details of the voxelized model in that retopology. You can plug a multi-res modifier and start increasing the amount of details in an incremental way. So in that scheme, I'm trying like to show a way to manage the level of details that you require in your high poly modeling. Usually, you have like to think about a proper way to apply your asset or your character. Of course, you start like with main shapes, and then you start moving forward with the secondary, tertiary to achieve like some sort of result. But the thing with Blender is that right now in the sculpting mode, we don't have layers like in ZBrush. It's planned to be released in a future update, but until we get the layer in the sculptor part of Blender, what I'm proposing here is like you can start thinking about a way to implement this like process creation. You see the different subdivision levels that the modifier has. Because the modifiers manage the amount of subdivisions and basically the resolution of your mesh with levels, what I'm proposing here is like, hey, you can start like creating the main shape to your asset with lower subdivisions after, of course, having a voxelized base and then doing like the retopo to extract the information from it. And I'm saying there, like, use the subdiv level 1 for getting the main shapes, but of course, that's just like a number to represent that the thing is going incremental depending on the level of details that you got there. So the more levels you got, more details is expected to have in your model. So the next subdivision levels, you can use like that amount of resolution to achieve identity on your model. Like you are seeing here, like different stages where I play with the different levels in an incremental logic to get more and more details, like you're seeing in the clouds and in the face there. And the higher amount of subdivision levels and the multi-res, you should use it to store tertiary details, basically. It's like the thing works like the how is it called in ZBrush? Like, well, I forget the name, but you can basically took those details and bake it previously in a different mesh. So this is like a video where I try to represent like, you know, the different stages that I was developing these kind of characters. Of course, those are concepting characters, but the logic behind of how I'm managing a lot of polygons, it's there. I'm going to show you after this another model with more aesthetics. Another interesting thing of the sculpture mode in Blender is that it allows you to have non-destructive changes with the stack modifiers. So basically, in those examples, those are really extreme, but it's to make you an idea of how you can play with the shape with a voxelized mesh in different ways, and you can get different kind of modifiers to get like your non-destructive stuff, you know, to visualize more properly the concept. So I think that's a powerful feature because it allows you to unlock different ways to see your character. So also you are not like making so interesting details with you are not applying those changes into your mesh. You can just turn off the modifier and go back to the initial state of your sculpt. Here, this is an example of the initial dragon that I show you. Basically how much detail I'm managing for the face. For this particular example, what I did was like try to get a lot of detail from the voxelized mesh and then do it like a retopology, a simple one, to after that get the voxelized mesh and the retopologized mesh and try to capture the details from the voxel model with the multi-resolution modifier has a feature where it allows you to capture the data of another different model. So once you capture that data, you can have like a good starting point to start incrementing the amount of geometry and start including basically different type of details. In this case, I'm incrementing the amount of resolution depending on the amount of details that I want to include or incorporate in the model. This is the torso of the dragon, like you are seeing there. Everything was carried out using the sculpting mode of Blender. Basically, it's the same logic. Once you get your base mesh planned, you can like start incrementing the amount of detail with the not just the multi-resolution modifier, but the other non-destructive modifiers that you need to achieve the shapes that you want. And this is the final high poly for the initial dragon, and basically running more than 80 million polygons inside Blender, and this is the rendering mode. I mean, I'm rendering that mesh on Eevee with a setup of lights, and I think that this is really important to visualize and get a proper idea of your model, because you can start including more lights, and even you can include an HDRI to make some sort of look depth previous to the final production of the asset. So I think that that's really interesting to see this kind of numbers on Blender. I'm not saying that this is a replacement for ZBrush, of course not. But it could be an alternate way for other artists that couldn't afford buy those kind of licenses. So this is the final result. It's rendered on Eevee. And of course, I took the details from the high poly, and I baked it in a low poly mesh, and I start from the previous high polys. I did a few rough textures, but this is the level of detail that I could achieve just trying to carry out all of the details using topology, not just displacement maps or textures, but also with topology. So despite that I'm talking about the sculpting mode, there is a lot of features on Blender that allows you to like create really complex assets. I want to show you the clothing part of that example there to try to explain what I'm trying to say about complex assets creation. For this case, I carry out the whole process using geometry, because you can easily like use displacement maps on your texture, but the main reason of this experiment was to try to stress Blender to see how far I can go with it. So basically, I use a combination of different modes inside Blender. I extract like with a mask slice a part of the cloth that I wanted to have in the dragon. And then I made like an automatic retopology to get like a quad-based mesh. And I start playing with some easy simulations inside Blender. And then with those simulations, the plan was to have a blockout shape to get some folds and some interesting things. And then I apply a multi-res modifier. I start polishing the folds and the details that I want to include in that part. And then I apply the multi-res, and in the sculpting mode, I mask the parts that I want to get rid of, like the damaged details. And with some particles and some add-ons, in this case the tissue add-on, I start including the details with, I instance the fiber meshes, like you see the tertiary details there. And I start including the thorns using the splines and that thing. I was trying to replicate like the same thing that some character artists did in ZBrush. They use fiber mesh to do that. But I replicate that pipeline for Blender, basically, using just features that Blender has. This is the result of it. It's been rendered on Eevee. And this is like an iteration to like, you see how powerful this is because you can like have different perspective about your character. And it's really faster because you are working in a non-destructive way and also you are just working in a single package. So you can see it with lights and different setups that allows you like to plan better that. The same principle was followed for this character. For the clothing part, I extract the part that I wanted to include in terms of clothing. I start applying some really quick cloth simulations in the block code. I start refining in the sculpting mode. And in this particular case, with color attributes, I masked the areas that I wanted to have with different details. And I use displacement maps in this case for having those different like kind of cloth details that you're seeing there in the jacket. This is the result. This is rendered on cycles, and it has no low poly mesh or something. The textures are procedurally, because that's one of the other advantages of Blender, because everything is connected. You can bring an attribute, which is a property on your mesh, to another environment inside Blender, for example, the shaded editor or the GeoNodes editor. So one of the most interesting features that recently Blender have been pushing really hard is to optimize the vertex painting. In the previous releases, it was not so good because it was really slow after a few amount of polygons, but then they start implementing the color attributes part for the sculpting mode. They include like this brush that allows you to paint over your image, like you were doing it in ZBrush with poly paint. So, but what is interesting of this feature is that it has a stack of different layers to store different color attributes. So this is an iteration of different masks that I did for this particular model. Once again, the model is fully voxelized. It has no low poly data. So you can see that basically I start masking or creating masks on black and white with different variants. And I connect those color attributes with a shader that allows me to create those different color variations in the skin. Basically, this is the pipeline that I got. You see there in this part that I got different masks painted in the sculpting mode. I store that data in the color attributes information. And this is the node that allows me to basically, where's the cursor? Basically, this is the node that allows me like to bring those properties in every different ecosystem than this sculpting mode. And with that, I just pull the name of the color attribute. In this case, for example, I got the freckles mask. So I just plug that shader in the, I plug that node in the shader, and I start like including everything that I want in that mask. You can also use the animation tools for your sculpts. For example, I'm not a character artist, but for example, for some figures, you want some poses, some dynamism. So you can do it applying a sculpting rig, I call it. So you can iterate between different poses and your figure and start like visualizing in a really fast way your high poly. For example, this is like different iterations of the first example. The same happens here. You see that it's the same mesh. The information that you are sculpting is stored in the base mesh, but in different keyframes I'm like moving the rig to see how it looks. And when I got a believable result or the result that I want, I just apply the rig, and I start from there, like including the details that I want. Oh, this is the example. For example, there. And when I got like some levels, I moved the part that I wanted to like polish, and I apply it. Now I'm going to talk about what I'm specialized, quote unquote, which is environment and props. This was achieved trying to use Blender in the whole pipeline creation. There is an established pipeline for 3D assets and environmental stuff. Like most of the companies doing video games have the same thing. I mean, they have their own set of tools for every stage of creation, but in this case, I tried to carry out the high poly and the bakes using Blender, and also create some tile materials, at least the high poly of the tile materials inside Blender. For example, these materials, the high poly was done in Blender. I make like the tile rocks, for example. I sculpt the tile in Blender, and then I bake it. I use some geonodes to extract an ID map, and the normal and height data information were baked with special materials, with a shader setup to extract like the necessary information to then go to designer and create the diffuse and some details in other maps. Blender fits with everything. So because it has a really good relation with other packages, you don't have problem moving the information that you got in Blender in other 3D packages or texturing softwares. So basically, Blender is compatible and has like different export methods to move your stuff or your models. So you won't have much problem, at least in game art, trying to integrate what you are doing in Blender with other softwares. This is more of this. This is the high poly for one of the materials that I did for the environment that I show you. Basically, what I did was like start like with geometry nodes. I create like a blockout where I make some interesting details procedurally, some damage, and then I apply those and I start increasing the geometry to sculpt a little bit more the rocks and get some more interesting secondary shapes. And upon that previous sculpt, I start including displacement map, different displacement map that I previously sculpted inside Blender. So this is the final result for the high poly. This has like almost 21 million polygons, and it basically worked inside Blender, so I didn't have much problem. Like I didn't move the sculpt to ZBrush to get that amount of detail. And this is like some of the nodes that I use to extract the most important like bakes to start playing in Substance Designer. So for the height map, this is a really easy setup of nodes, but it allows me like to move the different displacement or height information that I wanted. So it allows me like to control how much height information that I wanted without being worried about the size of the mesh. And the other one is basically a geonode that separates reads the separate meshes and creates an ID map with random values. Then I took those, we can call it clusters or textures, and I processed the rest of the data that I need in Substance Designer. This is the node in Substance Designer. It's a really easy one because most of the height information and normal maps were carried out in Blender. So what I did was like polish the normal maps, include some secondary or more details, and then I finalized the diffuse and the roughness map inside Designer. You can also see how your materials are blending inside Blender. You can like start visualizing how it's gonna behave, everything that you are processing or creating there. So this is like a setup to see how it's gonna look prior to the integration with engine. I mean, I try to like replicate a blended material that you can do in Unreal Engine or Unity to try to visualize inside Blender how it behaves with procedural mask or another mask created in other software. So you see here like I'm playing with some values there and yeah, basically seeing how it behaves. This is the node setup for it. So you can also go beyond that and create the materials in a really interesting way. For example, using simulations and ragdolls. in this project, I had to create like this kind of worm material, like a pile of worms that is blended in the structure. So what I did for this material was like create a simulation where the worms are falling to make it look more realistic, because, well, it's a different when you basically take the pile of worms and make it fall. You can do it in Designer, of course, like have some scatter individual assets inside it, but I think that the result is more realistic here. This is like the setup that I did. Basically, I create one worm, and I create like a ragdoll setup for it. And then I create a really simple script which create multiple instances to bring the simulation information to the other worms. And I make it fall to see how it interacts to each other. I, of course, did like a setup where the worms collide with different objects to make like that scatter effect. And the cool thing with this is that you can like iterate the process. You can alterate like the worm shape, and still you don't have to make too many changes because everything is interconnected inside Blender. And after that, you take that information and start like doing the bakes that you need to finalize the material. This is some interesting geonodes that allows me to plug some extra details, for example, set dressing assets. In this case, this is an EV generator. What basically this setup do is like create, you can draw the IVs there, and then you can make real instances of it, and then move it to the engine because it's a real instance. And once you get the result that you want, you can like iterate between different parameters to get some, different leaf positions, or randomize the way that it looks, and you hit apply the terms that you need to see the proper result. You apply and make a real instance for it, and move it to your engine, and everything is procedurally created. So this is really powerful, at least for game art creation. This is another geonode that works under the same principle, makes the instances real inside Blender, and then you can move it like an FBX object in your engine. If you want to change something, you just change the setup, the previous setup that you got there, and apply again the instance and move the FBX, and everything is like interconnected, not just inside Blender, but also with the engine that you are working to produce the environment. Oh, what happened? Oh. This is a last experiment that I was doing. Like, I was trying to produce an asset just using like the features for the sculpting mode. Of course, I did the experiment with a set dressing asset. What you are seeing here is that I'm with the color attributes, and with the new vertex paint system, I create the diffuse information, and then I create some masks labeled in a different color attributes, and I start like doing some texturing upon the high poly with the color attributes to process that information there. This is full high poly model. And then when I got the result that I wanted, which is this is the high poly, I start baking that in a low poly mesh, and I get the full asset basically made from the high poly conception. Of course, that's an experiment, and it's not intended for hero assets or other more important assets on video games, but I think that for set dressing would be really interesting to start exploring more efficient ways to speed up that process creation. This is basically the way that it works, the procedural material upon the high poly. You see that basically what is happening there is that you capture those information and those masks that you paint on your high poly model, And with the shader, you start moving stuff and maybe refining the masks that you wanted to incorporate in that high poly. And everything is basically created from the high poly model. Those are the color attributes that I'm using. Like I mask some cavities, some curvature stuff, and with the brush tool, with the paintbrush tool inside the sculpting mode, I start including what I want with some materials that you got or you have already made for previous project. And Blender has a lot of good stuff to integrate with other softwares. Even with other methodologies for modeling, in this case, I really like to create hard surface stuffs with CAD softwares. And Blender, you can basically bring a lot of CAD models into it and start cleaning the stuff and produce a game-ready asset. For example, in the hands of the girl, I create the mechanism and the prosthetics inside plasticity. And then with the bevel node, I start creating the edge and some damages there. But still, everything is high poly. You are texturing in a procedural way. This is the setup that I use for that. And for more hero assets, you can produce your high poly model with the CAD software that you want. And with Blender, if you want to create those smooth details in your model, you can do it with a shader in a non-destructive way. In this case, is the bevel node, which is also being implemented in other softwares like Marmoset. And you can play it with it and extract the bakes directly from Blender. After, of course, doing a proper mesh optimization of your previous model. But basically, that's some examples that I've been recently exploring. And also, they follow some principles that I tried to implement in my professional job to expose how Blender could fit in the pipeline. It not necessarily be a replacement for the traditional one, but could be a good complement for the actual pipeline implemented in some video game studios. The big conclusion, I think that it's industry standard. And yeah, thank you so much. Well, if you have some questions, I think that we are on time for it. All good? Comments, feedback? Well, you have my contact, so you can drive me there, or, well, I'll be talking for the conference if you want to talk. Thank you so much, and I really appreciate that you take this time to be here with me. Thank you.